Welcome everybody to this chit chat with the esteemed Dr. Nathaniel Swain. It is a real pleasure and privilege, Nathaniel, to be connecting with you in what is now this afternoon in New Zealand time. So thank you so much for joining me, and really looking forward to some of your insights and tapping into your knowledge around the science of learning.
Thank you, Carla. It's a real pleasure to join with you and also to reach all your fantastic colleagues in New Zealand as well. You're doing amazing work.
So Dr. Nathaniel Swain is a teacher, instructional coach and writer. He works as a senior lecturer in learning sciences at La Trobe University School of Education and Solar Lab, and he produces a blog for teachers that many of you will be familiar with, I'm sure. Dr. Swain's Cognitorium. I know some of my colleagues, Nathaniel, they're like, when's it coming? When's it coming? Nathaniel has taught a range of learners in schools and universities and founded a community of teachers committed to the science of learning. Think Forward Educators. Now 23,000 members and growing. Dr. Swain is a sought-after speaker on educational circuits and has a new book in 2024 entitled, I feel like the drum roll please little bit here, Harnessing the Science of Learning, Success Stories to Help Kickstart Your School Improvement. So thank you so much again, Nathaniel, for being willing to share some of the expertise that's set up in that magnificent brain of yours. Shall we kick off our chat with diving into that big question, what is the science of learning?
Great first question, and something that's probably on a lot of people's minds at the moment. I know that in some circles, especially with all the reform that's happening in New Zealand and in Australia, the term science of learning is almost getting a bit of an edge to it, and people seeing it as a bit of a weapon as well. So I would like to take an opportunity to demystify that term. I think it's nothing more than a description of the body of knowledge that we have from various thousands of research studies to do with the brain, how it learns, how children learn in classrooms, both longitudinal and once-off, experimental and observational, in the lab and in real schools, about how learning happens and how best to teach. And the science of learning really could be talked about and cut up in lots of different ways. But I guess when people talk about it for the purpose of teaching and what teachers need to know from that science, it's really what are the key principles that have been synthesized from all of that research and all of that study, and how can it be used and harnessed in the classroom. So some of the things that I think the science of learning helps illuminate, which I do talk about quite a lot in my work with schools and systems, is that actually learning is really hard. Daniel Willingham does a great job of saying that we obviously have our brains ready to learn sometimes, but often we probably like to revert to routine and thinking in the same sorts of ways and find it quite difficult to change our mind. So learning is not necessarily an easy process. In some ways, the brain wants to just keep doing what it usually does. That's one aspect, and we can delve deeper into why learning can be so challenging. But the second aspect I really like to point out is that one of the things that helps learning happen is connecting knowledge to the knowledge that's in our long-term memory. So when students learn new information and connect it to things that they've already learned, this is how the learning process can happen really successfully, building up those networks of understanding and schemas of what a particular topic or a particular set of skills involves. And then the third principle that leans into that really, I think, is that great teaching can help facilitate that learning process, even though it's quite difficult. And sometimes students won't learn the things that we try and teach them. And then the last principle is that forgetting is actually part of the learning process. So all those things that we diligently explain and explore and get our students practicing in one of the terms, when we revisit it the following term, yes, often they will have forgotten it, but we can actually do a lot in our teaching practice to reduce that forgetting curve. And those are the four main things I like to talk about as an introduction to the science of learning, really.
That's really insightful. If we come to the connecting knowledge piece, I think it would be good if we could dive into that a little bit further. So you said connecting knowledge that's in our long-term memory, and then you started talking about working from some existing knowledge that we have, and of course you called that schema. Would you be able to tell us a little bit more? What can that practically look like in a classroom setting? My head goes to when we're reading a text, and if we're reading a text that we have never come across anything to do with any of the content in that text, that would be somewhat challenging. Can you talk to us a little bit about how would we go about ensuring that we teach in a way that supports or acknowledges that importance of that principle number 2 of connecting
Mm.
knowledge?
So in that example that you've given there, Carla, I think the most important thing that teachers can do is really try and understand what our students do have in their long-term memory about that particular topic. What vocabulary can they draw upon? What life experiences? What awareness of how that text sort of works, and how it comes to bear in terms of the topic. If you have an awareness of what that is as the teacher, you know whether you're going to be activating that prior knowledge or whether you need to
Mm,
actually build it. And if you're
mm,
building it, you might not be able to go straight from let's build this understanding of something completely new into reading a complex text on that
mm,
particular topic. You may want to use a bridging sort of text that is slightly easier, that helps to reinforce that knowledge building that you're doing, because it might be a topic or a story that is completely outside of our students' experience. When students can't make that connection from the known to the new, learning just won't stick. So there's this
mm,
great body of knowledge built together from Ojibel's meaningful learning theory, which is actually quite old, but does connect very well with things that teachers will know about from their teacher training from what's been popular over the last 30 years. So schema sort of theory, or Piaget's sort of
mm,
contributions back in the day. It's essentially, if we can't help students make meaningful connections to what they're learning about, it just won't stick in the first instance. So
mm,
yes, you need to know, are you activating prior knowledge, in which case you need to remind and show and link and sort of see whether students can connect, or are you building for the first time, in which case, if you're starting from scratch with a particular topic or a particular set of skills, you might not be ready to apply that straight away. You might be at that acquisition and fluency sort of stage rather than application. Yeah.
that's awesome. When I think back to my teaching experience, I think that I was quite onto it with knowing both what my students' interests were and what they knew, about certain things through conversation. But I think that I was somewhat ill-informed in my text choices because my text choices were centered around what they were interested in, whereas
Hmm.
now
Hmm.
I have so much greater depth of understanding around the knowledge component that they
Mm.
already have existing and where I'm trying to take them to build knowledge. And so I wonder if we've had this somewhat misconstrued idea of choosing text around student interests. I know that's definitely,
That's
when I
it's
look
a
back.
really interesting talking point, isn't it? To sort of jump in there a little bit. I think there's a big idea about helping students to see themselves in the curriculum, and that responsiveness and our culture responsive and culturally sustaining pedagogies is really important and definitely has a really important role. I think we need to sort of add to that. That's sort of the concept of the curriculum as a mirror. So it's being able to see yourself within the curriculum. Something that I talk about with my colleague Reed Smith, who you may know some of his
Mm,
work as well. He's a PhD student in the Solar Lab and one of the co-CEOs of Ochre Education, which I'm not sure whether their resources get used in New Zealand, but they're certainly very well used in Australia now. They've got such fabulous things. Um, Reed Smith and I talk about in our chapter on curriculum that we should see the curriculum as an opportunity for a window, a mirror, but also a window. So
mm,
when curriculum is acting as a window, it's actually an opportunity to take students outside of their everyday experience, to see other worlds, to see other
mm,
perspectives, whether that's from history, geography, science, the arts, different kinds of stories and literature. And I think if we have that in mind, the curriculum has two jobs. It's to create mirrors and affirm and validate and value, but it's also to challenge, to provoke, to
mm.
explore, discover as well. I think we can then get the balance right in that
Yeah,
regard. Mm,
yeah, I really like that. When we're talking about great teaching, and I wrote down great teaching facilitates great learning,
that's exactly right.
to kind of spring into your third principle, if we're talking about knowledge, just thinking about building knowledge from existing schema and knowing what's there to take students further, knowledge alone isn't enough for the teacher to know about great teaching, right? So we would benefit potentially from knowing about what cognitive load theory is and how that
Mm,
comes into play in the science of learning and what that might mean in terms of us really honing our great teaching to ensure great learning happens.
mm.
So could you talk to us about cognitive load theory? What actually is it?
So it's a really influential theory, and it's been around for a little while, since the 80s. It's an Australian researcher, Professor John Sweller, has founded it, but it's also been developed in many other studies. It's essentially a way of trying to conceptualize the limitations of our cognitive architecture. That is, our working memory can only hold a few items at a time and is easily overloaded, but our long-term memory is practically infinite. And when we have things in our long-term memory that we can retrieve and we can bring to mind to help us solve a problem, then those cognitive load effects are not nearly as great. So cognitive load theory says that there's two kinds of load that students will experience. There's the intrinsic load of the task, how hard it is. We don't want it to be too hard and too easy, so we're looking to
Mm,
optimize that load. But that intrinsic load will be different based upon the prior knowledge and skills of each student. So a
mhm,
task that's easy for me might be hard for someone else, depending on their background and their prior sort of skills and understanding. The other kind of load, though, is extraneous load. And this is one to really think about as a teacher, because this comes both through the environment and how the information is presented, the materials that we show students and how information is shown and paired with visuals or not. And it's also to do with the way your classroom routines are set up and how easy it is for students to pay attention and stay in contact with you,
mm,
and not sort of break focus, because all of that could be extraneous to the actual task that they're meant to be doing. And the final part of extraneous load, which is the bit that teachers probably don't like to think about as much, is our tendency to put a whole lot of other fluff in around the core instruction. And this is even when you want to tell a nice little anecdote, or you diverge down a tangent, or when you give a
mm,
long-winded explanation rather than a really bulletproof definition. This sort of changes in the manner and the structure of instruction can also contribute to the extraneous load. And as a result,
mm,
your working memories of our students can be taken up with the things that we want, which is the cognitive load of the task, intrinsic, or it could be actually taken up with a lot of extra stuff. And there's only so much
mm,
room in working memory. It's really easy for students to get off track. So we want to
mm,
try and minimize the extraneous as much as possible, make our instruction efficient, effective, and to the point. But also ensure there's adequate challenge, but not too much challenge, which is where the intrinsic part comes in.
mm. So we've got a link. Oh.
Sorry, just letting the dog in there. Was growling at the door. Sorry to interrupt your thought there, Carla.
No, that's okay. So when you're talking, I wrote down, so this is where we have to dovetail in Dr. Archer's cut the fluff, teach the stuff. That's exactly what you're talking about.
And I did use that word fluff
You
directly,
did,
so I'm
you
glad that
did,
that
and that
activated that little
that would have
meme. Yeah.
activated that for me. So when you're talking to, I think like specific phrases pop to mind in terms of
Mm,
how do we do this in our classroom, right?
mm,
Um, we have clear communication. We have specific teaching routines that are
mm-hmm.
somewhat, and teaching routines that are replicated day on, day off, day on, day
Yeah,
off. And
predictable, structured. Yeah.
they're predictable, they're structured. Students know what to expect. So they're not dealing with the intrinsic load of the content through the task as well as the
Too much
extraneous
extraneous. Yeah.
through the routine changing all the time.
And in terms
Um,
of a misconception, I don't know if I'm jumping in too quick here, but to expand upon that, sometimes I think we have an alternative tension there as educators to try and mix it up and to keep it
mm,
novel and to make it exciting. And so we
mm,
might sort of say, well, we're a bit sick of this boring old routine. We might just do this task in a different way today. We did addition like this, but today we're going to do it in a different way, even though the learning intention is the same. And what can happen for our students is they might not even realize that the learning intention is the same. If we change
mm,
the task every day and it's a different sort of activity or a different routine, they might not realize that we've been actually working on the same thing day in, day out, because there is so much extraneous load to try and figure out what's meant to happen. Do I pick up my worksheet now? Who am I meant to be working with? Is it my turn to speak or is it my turn to listen? Is this task related to that task, or I'm not quite sure what this step is? All of that extraneous stuff, if it's not necessary, it's potentially interfering with the actual core learning. But as you said, if you have a good routine and you've invested in that and it's become something somewhat automated, then it doesn't take up any cognitive load, because they know how to get their whiteboard out. They know what to do with when they work in groups of 2 or groups of 4. They have good norms that they follow that make it easy for them to stay focused. This is just routine. The new stuff is the learning stuff, which is what we really want to teach.
So earlier you mentioned, that learning is hard and it's not an easy process. And am I right in thinking that we can be really mindful of that always, and ensuring that because we know learning is hard and not an easy process, for us as teachers and educators who are teaching students regularly, it's really important that we're aware of intrinsic and extraneous load and try to keep that at the forefront of when we're planning our instruction, when we're honing our delivery, when we're setting up our classroom, and for where we're going to place where everybody sits even. I know that's another area that you've talked about, even as to what's on our classroom walls and what is distracting, that actually is distracting and causing our students to take the attention away from the task and the core learning that we actually want to have going on.
And definitely. So you've hit on all of the environmental aspects of extraneous load there, which are so important, as well as the routine sort of based ones in your classroom sort of structures, the way that you set up your day and make it easy for your students to know what's coming next. So it's crucial. And I think we've got lots of pushes and pulls as educators, because we want the spaces and the ways that we work and the way that we bring the education experiences to life to be warm and to be inviting and to reflect our personality. And I wouldn't want anyone to think for a moment that I'm saying that you have to teach only in a certain way and it's rigid and it's a one size fits all. Rather, it is a process of thinking, well, this is how I like to teach and this is how I like to structure my classroom or organize my information, but potentially less is more in those aspects. So if you've got an overly convoluted decoration system in your classroom and you've got lots of stuff going on and it is front and center rather than somewhat towards the back stage of your classroom, that is potentially contributing to distraction. And the same can be said of if you've got particular routines and they tend to take longer, or they tend to be more elaborate than they probably need to be, then you can also take that principle to how we like to do things. I know some people, when they're doing the role, for example, they might use that as an opportunity to do a task that students have to respond to each day, and it changes every day. And they're often doing that first thing when the bell goes, when that's the prime time in my experience to get them learning, to get them into that sort of routine, sort of retrieval practice and review and getting started with their day. I like to do the well-being and nurturing sort of aspects almost a little bit later, after we've done some of those hard yards and we know that they need that opportunity to sort of settle and rest. So even something simple as how quickly do you get through your role, and does it eat into 10 or 15 minutes of your instructional time in the prime time of the day, which is first thing in the morning? If that's the case, then it may well be contributing to that just extraneous load of your classroom. So I know that for some people, they're like, oh, but I really like doing those things, and I think that's a really nice way to start the day. And I would say that you do you find the best way that suits your classroom. But if you feel like there's an opportunity where, like, oh yeah, I could actually tighten that up, or I could get more out of my students in this part of the day, because I guarantee most teachers will say they don't have enough time.
100%.
And that time is disappearing not just through instruction, it's disappearing for lots of different reasons. And when we refocus and say, well, what's absolutely necessary and what's absolutely beneficial, and when does it make most sense to prioritize one thing over another, we can actually get the most of our instructional minutes that way and ensure that learning is really core, and the other stuff, which is really nice but not completely necessary, especially first thing in the morning, could almost come a little bit later.
I just want to pick up on what you just said, get the most of our instructional minutes. That's got to be at the forefront of every single teacher's mind. How do I get the most of those instructional minutes? And then what do I do with those instructional minutes?
Mm.
You mentioned before about review and retrieval. There's some really nice words that get us thinking about what we should be including in our routines and our lesson sequences. And review and rehearsal and retrieval, those 3 R's are definitely sitting there front and center. Can you give us just a quick rundown of what each of those three are and why are they so important? Such an important and somewhat, I'm going to say, pivotal piece of us ensuring that learning does take place in our classrooms.
So I was before this podcast, I was reviewing what the many definitions of those words are, because in some ways the review is used a little bit synonymously with retrieval in the Australian context. I think if we talk about retrieval first, because that's the main term that's used when we talk about the importance of retrieval practice, this is essentially one of the power tools of education that we can use to ensure that students do remember the things that we teach them. And it's not through just looking at material or hearing the teacher talk about the material again. I know that if you remember your secondary school, high school days, you'll sort of have begged your teacher to can you just go through that again and teach us one more time? That process feels like we're learning, but it's actually a bit of a misnomer, because we only really truly strengthen our learning connections, and our students only strengthen their pathways of these different parts of knowledge and skills that they're learning if they try and retrieve. So if they try and test themselves and see if they remember, that's how true sort of combating of the forgetting curve actually occurs. When we just read over things or hear things again a second time, it feels like we know it, but we probably aren't strengthening that connection nearly as much as we can. So review for me is a term that we use to talk about the way we facilitate some retrieval practice. Sometimes retrieval practice is a quiz, sometimes it's a brief task on a whiteboard, or it might be a multiple choice sort of low stakes situation. But for me, daily review is a really big thing at the moment in Australia, especially in schools that are adopting practices that align well with the learning sciences. And daily review is a fast-paced, really fun and exciting opportunity to look at previous learning and to try and master all those little pieces all together. And so in the math space, it would be looking at all those common facts and number bonds and multiplication facts and number connections and number lines and so on, anything that's been taught before. And in the English space, it's all of those skills within phonemic awareness, code knowledge, blending and segmenting, spelling rules that we've learned but maybe have started to forget, and then testing yourself on those, not just going over them, but actually seeing if you can recall them. So quick, fast responses, call and answer, whiteboard responses, pair shares and cold calls, all of those things can make that, but you could get through 40 or 50 different responses in that 10-minute period if you operate in that sort of way. So the third one that you had there was rehearsal. And for me, I'm not sure if you've got a different working definition for rehearsal there in the work that you're doing, Carla, but for me, rehearsal is probably to do more with the middle of the lesson and when you are taking the initial instruction that you've gotten from your teacher, and students are having to try it for themselves and see if they can go through the motions, sometimes synonymous with practice. I know that in many contexts, we talk about model practice, which is the I do, guided practice, which is the we do, and then, independent practice, which is the you do. And so in many ways, rehearsal will occur in different sorts of levels of independence across those three things. Most of the bulk is taken by the teacher initially with the I do, and then it moves to shared with we do, and then you do is independent. But practice and rehearsal is really important during all of that. The last thing I'd want people to think when they look at the implications from the science of learning is that kids need to sit there and they need to just listen and just sort of nod and smile. Instead, I really like this distinction that Patricia, that Bain and Agarwal have talked about in their book. It's now escaped me. Powerful Teaching. Sorry, it's Powerful Learning. They've got two books now, Powerful Learning and Powerful Teaching. In those books, they talk about outformation being more important than information. So information goes into students' heads, hopefully, but what really ensures that it sticks is their ability to generate and to
Yeah.
get that information back out and
Mm,
to put it into their own words and apply it in their own ways. So I think the rehearsal part is an opportunity for students to engage in that generative learning, which again is another cool learning theory from the learning sciences too.
mm. And the more overt that is, the better, right? So when they're
Definitely. We don't want them
interacting,
just to repeat it and
mm,
say the same thing back. We want them to take what we've said, connect it to what they've already learned, and then apply it to something new. That's the ultimate goal of all of this teaching and learning, definitely.
mm, mm. It's so powerful. I'm just thinking too, yesterday afternoon, I was working with a team of teachers and we were talking about explicit instruction, and we were focusing on the 13 elements of explicit instruction as per how Dr. Archer teaches them. And
Yes.
we were talking through those, and we sort of focused on, well, we know one exposure doesn't lead to learning, but actually when 20 minutes later those teachers went to retrieve some of those 13 elements, they were seemingly surprised at how few they could actually
hmm
retrieve. So I think it's really good for us to, as teachers and educators, to put ourselves into that experience of discovering that actually learning does not happen in one exposure, and we will not commit stuff to long-term memory if we've just heard it once. So
Exactly. And
we
that
know this,
simple,
we've all
yeah.
experienced it. We've got to remember it when we're in front of the children that we teach, or the adults that we teach, or whoever it is that we teach.
And we can easily equate performance being a poor proxy for learning, as from the UK says. If we get successful performance, it looks like students are learning, which is why when they discover
Mm,
something or when they create something or provide an interesting point in a discussion, it feels like we've achieved our goal. But actually, learning needs to be long term. It needs to be something that
mm,
sticks.
mm,
It can't just be one moment. It has to be something that's sustained and maintained.
mm,
So as a result, we do need to think about learning differently as not just I've explained it once, you've shown me you can do it once, so therefore it's done. And I think it's good as adults to try and commit something to memory and see how difficult it is to hold. It could be 5 things that might be tricky, not let alone sort of 10 or 13 as well. But
mm,
yeah, holding all of those items together can be tricky, even though when someone's explaining it to us, we sort of nod along and think, oh, yep, I've got that. That makes
mm,
sense. That recognition is a lot easier than the actual recall, which is a lot
mm.
harder.
So let's talk a little bit about how we might get it into long-term memory then
Mm,
by sort of moving our focus into practice.
mm.
And can you talk to us a little about what are the types of practice that, we really would our students would benefit from if we ensure are in our lesson structures and are in our teaching routines?
So there's a few different ways I could answer this. I probably will start, it's probably easier to start with a non-example and then talk about an example. There's lots
Mm-hmm.
of tensions in education now where to get authentic or sort of real sort of learning happening, we need to sort of get students doing hands-on and tasks, and it might be inquiry sort of projects where they're pretending to be scientists or acting like mini historians and doing their own investigations. It might be they're trying to be mathematicians and doing complex, rich tasks, for example, and engaging in what some people call productive struggle. So this can look like learning and it can feel like learning because we're starting with the end point of where we want students to be, which is creative and critical thinkers. But really, if we want to use the knowledge that's there in the science of learning to our best efforts as teachers, we actually need to think about the pathway toward that independent learning and
Mm,
creative and critical thinking as being one that is more structured and one that does gradually release responsibility rather than just automatically release and sort of chuck students in the deep end. I often think about swimming as well as another example where it's really obvious why explicit instruction and why that sort of fully guided instruction, which is sometimes it's called from Sweller, Clark, and
mm,
Kirshner. We'll use that language as well, as opposed to minimally guided, which is more chuck them in the deep end. With swimming, it's really obvious that swim teachers would be very irresponsible to chuck the students into the deep end without proper instruction. And that end point of being able to tread water and to cope with different varied swimming situations and swim for a long period of time actually is built upon months
mm,
and months and months
yeah.
and years even of practice in much more structured and predictable and scaffolded environments. So the first part of swimming, just like the first part of reading, is almost familiarization with and coping with the challenge of getting into water, and I'll see how far I can stretch this metaphor. But there's actually a lot of work just on helping kids to feel comfortable in that space and to feel comfortable putting their ears under. And any parent will know that that can actually be a big barrier for swimming lessons commencing, because some kids don't like getting their ears wet. So if we take that to phonics now, there's a lot of time spent with just looking at those sound letter patterns before we even get to those amazing stories and even sentences. It's looking at the sound letter patterns, how the codes work, how they, there are sounds within words and how we blend them back together, all that phonemic awareness. And for a long time, people thought that, spending time on that boring old code and sound stuff is going to put people off reading because it's so far away from the end goal, which is children sitting down enraptured in a book. And in many ways it is, but it's not the end point that we're interested in at this part of the process. It's the pathway. So for any instruction, whether in any subject, what we need to think about is what is the end goal, and where do we want them to be by the end of the year level, and how can we break it down into manageable chunks that do build upon one another, and we have interlocking understandings and skills from knowing that knowledge does power our learning. How do we build up that knowledge of the code or of maths facts or of concepts within the discipline we're interested in, that then eventually create completely independent, creative, and critical thinkers. So in a nutshell, that's the thing, that when you zoom in, it can become more complicated. But I love the kinds of lesson structures and unit structures that do take this into account and basically say that activating prior knowledge, connecting it to the new knowledge, explicitly modeling, demonstrating, and then having that guided practice before independent practice, and doing things like checking for every 3 or 4 minutes so that if your instruction is working or not. All of this adds up to very, very high quality instruction, which oftentimes is explicit, but eventually is also open-ended and what Tom Sherrington likes to call mode B teaching, where you say, well, I've done the hard yards of getting you to this point. Now it's your time to go to those inquiry and those projects. And you're going to jump in there and find out something for yourself based upon the knowledge that you've learned. And I think when you inquire from a place of knowledge rather than a place of relative ignorance, all of that time is going to be much better spent. A nice little phrase that Shane Pearson and I like to say is inquiring from a place of knowledge. And I think that little fact that, inquiry is useful once students have a proper background and have enough awareness to ask deep and interesting questions, that can make all the difference to say that it's not all or nothing. It's not the teacher is directing things all day, every day. You don't have to be a sage on the stage every day, is what I like to say. But you do need to know when it's time to take the reins of the instruction and when to pull back, obviously.
Wow, that's awesome. So much gold in there, Nathaniel.
It's probably too much information. Thinking about cognitive overload, I've sort of unleashed a little bit there. So if you need to rewind at this point, that's okay.
But we can unpack all of that. And just the way you actually started with your example and non-example, I really want to spotlight people's attention to that, because that is actually also such a key part of explicit instruction for helping deliver a message where informational messaging is so important, is to give an example and a non-example so we can see a real contrast in those two ideas. And that was really clear. Another piece that I just want to pick out in everything that you were saying is that as you talked us through your analogy of swimming, and then you went into phonics instruction, and you'd framed that so well in helping us to understand that it's important that we build up the content and the foundational skills, and how we're building up the content that maybe lives in a structured literacy domain from a scope and sequence, but the how we're doing that is through those principles from the science of learning.
Definitely.
And so is there anything that you want to share with us around the importance of us, particularly here in New Zealand at this point in time, understanding that there is not a separation between the science of learning and, for example, implementing with fidelity a structured literacy approach to ensure better outcomes? They are actually partners in this process of raising our literacy student outcomes.
Definitely. And I think we like to say in Australia and in some other contexts that the science of reading, where structured literacy comes from, is a subset of the science of learning. And the science of maths also sits in there as well. It's like, what do we best know about the teaching of maths and how these learning effects appear in the numeracy sort of space. So it's really, there's some people, and reading out of all of them has been studied probably the most, and then maths maybe the second most. These effects that we see around cognitive load, around the importance of attention, the impact of clear instructions and explanations and modeling. Something we haven't talked about is how novices versus experts will approach a task and what things they benefit from. But essentially, when you've got expert swimmers, if we go back to the swimming example, and you get them to do that water familiarization stuff or try and interfere with the way that their strokes are working when actually they're probably proficient in those strokes already, we can get something very interesting happening called the expertise reversal effect, where too much instruction in a student who's already mastered a particular aspect can interfere with their performance. In maths, it's really easy when you think about students that have automated a particular process in order to do a multiplication problem. You bring in another process which is slightly different, but not necessarily any better. That may well interfere with their ability to do that process initially until they sort of adopt it. So I think it's about knowing that the structured literacy and the science of reading do come from very adjacent bodies of knowledge that do overlap and are intersected, and that the instructional practices that fall out of these great studies that they've done to understand how the brain learns really have implications for any subject, whether it's literacy, maths, and the other curriculum areas as well.
It's really been exciting to see in many schools across the country how teachers have really learned about that. And what we see is they're transferring their teaching practices into other areas across the curriculum, and they feel so good about that. And their students are feeling good about it, and the outcomes are increasing. And it's so incredibly rewarding.
It's like there's this sort of spreading sort of effect where if you get good instructional opportunities and you get that feedback from students that they're learning more and they're having fun and you're feeling more effective, it naturally flows that many teachers will say, I think I could do this with another subject, or I think I could adopt some of these principles and adapt it for this particular subject area. So we've had people discover explicit instruction because they've started their structured literacy journey and they've realized that other subjects could benefit from that level of rigor as well.
Awesome. Nathaniel, what would you say is your kind of one or two key messages for teachers who, I explained to you just before we came on where we're at here in New Zealand. We're moving into having a mandate of structured literacy approaches, beginning with our very foundation year levels, and the science of learning is really top of mind for our Ministry of Education currently. So as we move forward into really working hard to implement these practices and to really strengthen our pedagogy in these areas, what do you think is really important for us to keep in mind?
So a few different messages we could jump on there, but given there is a lot of change and things are in flux, much like there is in a lot of our states and territories here in Australia as well, there's a lot of movement, a lot of excitement, but also potentially trepidation, is to remember to be kind to yourself as an educator. I think when we're saying that knowledge powers learning and that learning's really hard and that great instruction does make a difference, we can't assume that every educator or teacher will have all of that pedagogical content knowledge ready to go. Sometimes when you have to teach things explicitly, it means that you have to be interested and knowledgeable about things that you've just assumed has always happened by itself. So without wearing out the analogy of the swim coach too much, if you imagine that you've got a swim teacher who's used to getting proficient swimmers and all they're giving them instruction on is how to improve their breaststroke, for example, when they suddenly get complete novices and they have to not just chuck them in the pool and hope for the best, but actually show them the process and step by step of water familiarization and the skill of going underwater for the first time, all of that sort of thing. So if you're like that and you've never had to explain how spelling happens or how it works because you've just let that occur by itself in a different era where structured literacy hasn't been a thing, then it's okay to say, I don't know that much about how this system works. And I think I've got a bit of learning here, and know that there's lots of free and also very reasonably priced resources out there that you can access that help complement that knowledge, and that it's okay for you to have cognitive load effects as you're trying to get your head around it. You might be learning 1 or 2 weeks ahead of your students sometimes, which is where quality curriculum materials and really great resources that you can adapt for your classroom can be helpful, because there's no need to reinvent the wheel and start from scratch. I think we can actually learn a lot through high quality materials that complement the professional learning that we're doing. So I think, that message message of kindness is really important, because we may well feel very overwhelmed with the content that we're trying to teach, but then also instructionally with the way that we're trying to teach it. We might not be used to using mini whiteboards, or feel a bit of trepidation about calling upon students without putting their hands up, for example. And it's okay to be a bit concerned about what that means and how it all works, and to know that there's many great colleagues that you have in New Zealand that are doing those things, and to lean on each other in that way.
100%. Yeah. Nathaniel, you have shared so many pearls of wisdom with us, and really, really appreciate that. I'm just going to capture a few of my favorites from our chit chat this afternoon. First and foremost, I want to put the spotlight back on intrinsic and extraneous load. That's something for me that at the moment I'm sitting, I've been actually listening to some podcasts over the last week, and there's some real connections. So I'm very conscious that because of the podcasts I've been listening to, I've got a little bit of schema, a little bit more schema sitting there around those. And I hope that for those who listen to this chit chat, they'll have schema they recognize in different areas that will sort of like be a magnet to areas you've talked about. But I think the chat around extraneous load and what we can do to minimize that is something really important for us to be thinking about. You talked about retrieval being one of the power tools of education. I also want to spotlight that and encourage teachers, irrespective of where they are on their journey of implementation, to always be thinking about kind of how they're honing their practice in that space. And I guess that takes us to that great little quote of yours, getting the most out of your instructional minutes. So we're always thinking, and maybe what we're thinking about as we do this little bit of me reviewing what you've been saying and trying to retrieve your key pieces is that actually this is about ongoing or continuous learning and improvement ourselves. We are never, any single one of us, completely on top of all of this. And the students that we teach will change all the time and have different things going on. So
and that's the exciting bit, I think, as well, is that you don't have to get it 100% right every time, because it is a dynamic and a moving sort of target. And ideally, explicit instruction should never be equated with lecturing or just delivering information, because it is a dynamic process of input and output, and using as much of what the students are giving back to you to inform what you're going to do next. And that's where it's exciting. And you're right, you never stop improving and honing different tricks and tips that you pick up along the way.
Yeah, 100%. And I think that's where maybe, just maybe, we could start to think that maybe that's where the interest lies here, not in the decorations around the classroom, not in switching up necessarily the routine or feeling we have to change things. Maybe it's around how we focus on our own delivery and really hone that and try to sharpen that and put our focus there. And my last thing that I want to pick up is the outformation. Thank you very much for sharing that. That's really, really going to fit with me in my own personal professional learning as well. How am I really knowing where I'm at with that? And so I need to get that information out to check how close it is into that long-term memory. So thank you so much, Nathaniel, for your time this afternoon. I know you're an incredibly busy man who is in hot demand, so we really do appreciate you taking some time to share your knowledge with everybody here in New Zealand who's really, really working hard to shift their practice. I'd like to thank everybody who has joined us to listen to this chat with Nathaniel. I encourage you to, we'll pop your blog links and other links into our chit chat, Nathaniel, when we post it. And we really, really look forward to the release of your book, which I understand is going to be happening around October. Is that correct?
Yes, October, November. I don't know whether there's any delay across the stretch of ocean between us, but I think around late October is fairly safe, I think, and hopefully a little bit earlier. I'm just doing the final proofing now, and then it's all left to the printers and things like that, which is exciting.
Really exciting. Awesome. And for those of our listeners who want to learn a little bit more about the science of learning and explicit instruction, we have our symposium, Cultivating the Literacy Landscape, coming up, which is the 20th and the 22nd of August in Wellington and Auckland. And we have we are bringing across Sarah Athome from your neck of the woods, Nathaniel.
Amazing.
Yeah, and also Dr. Carolyn Strom and Dr. Anita Archer. So pretty excited to be
You're in for an
getting
absolute treat there. That is incredible.
pretty excited to be having that fantastic trio land on our shores in New Zealand. So thank you so much again, Nathaniel, and thank you to everybody who has listened in this afternoon.
And thank you very much for having me. And I applaud everything that your fantastic colleagues and fellow teachers and educators are doing in New Zealand. I'm so excited for you.